Poverty goes hand in hand with discrimination. Austerity and cuts, when they happen, lead to a rise in fascism. That history tells us that happens every time. When fascism rises, that empowers those who hold racist views to act upon their racist views and emboldens them. So all of these things have a knock-on impact. So that's why poverty has to end, as well as racism ending at the same time. But we also need the legacies of colonialism and empire and enslavement to be addressed. So that means we need decolonization. One of the things that allows institutional racism and systemic racism to thrive is the legacies of colonialism. So those things need to be acknowledged and addressed. So there's not an easy solution, but I also think that racism is a global issue. So if we can't solve it in one country and then allow it to continue in another country, and it impacts on all of us world over. So because for those people who are living in an African or Caribbean country, doesn't mean to say the racism doesn't exist and those legacies don't exist. They do. And we are talking about people fleeing countries to come to the UK. And key reasons why people are fleeing those countries are climate change, persecution, conflict, and poverty. And sometimes it's a combination of all of those things, because most people who face climate displacement are displaced in their own country initially. So they can't, so people who live off the lands can no longer do that. They're forced into city areas and town areas which were already overcrowded, which then creates a situation of conflict and poverty, and then means that people have to flee their country. But when we look at those countries that they're fleeing from, they are countries where they're countries that were colonized by Europeans, or they're countries where there were illegal wars, illegal occupations during conflict. So they're effectively countries where the West have interfered in those countries and created that division and poverty and conflict in the first place. And then you have European countries saying we're full up, countries like the UK, they can't come in. If we look at, for example, what's happening with Ukrainian refugees, what's happened to them is absolutely horrific. I mean, it's terrible. They've been completely displaced. They're going through all sorts of horrendous things. But actually, the way that they're being received in the UK is quite different to black and brown people when they're displaced because of conflict. So, you've got Eurostar and airlines saying you can travel for free. In contrast, other refugees are having to hide on lorries or go on those small boats that we've been talking about. You've got Airbnb and hotels saying we'll give you accommodation, restaurants saying come in. Well, one of the key things we do in our work with refugees is to supply food and ingredients for cooking to the Refugee Community Kitchen, which is a charity in northern France. But before that, we used to work directly when there was an infrastructure with refugees to bring cultural and religious food, food that meets cultural and religious needs for different communities, and supply them with the ingredients so that they can make their own cultural food. And so we are fundraising for aid. Then we're taking that aid there, and then people are being given solidarity meals by a charity because they've got no other choice, which is not the most dignified way to receive food. Nobody wants to receive their food in that way if they could help it. But in contrast, Ukrainian refugees are saying, come into restaurants, come into hotels, and we'll give you meals in a dignified way, in a nice surrounding, not being beaten up and kicked by the police and threatened by the police. Sometimes that food has to be distributed in the sanctuary of a church or a mosque because of the brutality that refugees are facing. But also people like ourselves doing that work are also threatened. So when we take aid, we are racially profiled. We've been stopped under the Terrorism Act. We've been barred from going into France. We've been stopped and searched by police in between border control. They look for refugees in our vehicle, and they've even asked us, are we the same people going back that came out, i.e. are we refugees smuggling ourselves into the UK? So this is the contrast and difference in treatment. So when we talk about inhumanity, that difference of treatment has to change. If somebody's displaced and they're a refugee, then why isn't there that response to all refugees that we're seeing to Ukrainian refugees? We know the reason, but that's another inequality and stark difference of treatment. So unless we're treated as equal human beings in society, across society and globally, then racism is not going to go away.
Wow, so much to